Astrocartography is a great tool and I love it, but there's so many layers. So the location itself has its own birth chart. And sometimes the birth chart of, even if you've got great lines there, that city may not work well for you because the relation between your chart and that city's chart aren't a match.
Hello, and welcome to Holistic Ambition, where we talk with visionary leaders about creating a career, relationships, and life that is sustainable to your well-being, meaningful, and a lot of fun in the process. I'm your host, Stephanie Thoma, founder of Holistic Ambition, leadership coach, and author of Confident Introvert. Today, we have a very special guest, Rebecca Farrar. She is also known as the Wild Witch of the West, which is an archetypal astrologer and writer living in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically the Coast Miwok territory. Her work has been featured in Elle, Reader's Digest, Bustle, Astrology.com, and Elite Daily. For more than a decade, Rebecca has offered down-to-earth astrology readings focused on the asteroids, dwarf planets, soul care, feminine archetypes, depth psychology, relationships, and life purpose. In 2013, she completed her master's in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, and her thesis titled Stargazing, Reenchantment Through Language. That combined linguistics, the evolution of consciousness, and the human relationship to cosmos. All right, so now I'm so curious, Rebecca, about this relationship with linguistics and the cosmos.
Yeah. So for me, a big aspect of astrology was that when I first started learning about it, I just thought it was kind of silly. Like, how could you put these personalities in 12 boxes? And so for me, when we look at the relationship with the stars and humans, it's about the complexity that's there. And I started to research the language that we use, English, for those of us right now speaking. And people tend to think of like Sanskrit and these other languages as being really sacred. But English actually has etymologies that were very much based around people trying to commune with the cosmos. And so a lot of our everyday words are actually from the etymologies of people who made them up, who were very much intertwined with that relationship. And so for me, that's where language and communication come together around the cosmic experience.
Yeah, I've even seen a few documentaries even about language, but about sound and music. So I'm curious when it comes to the relationship of sound and the cosmos. An example that's coming up right now is being able to move heavy objects in ancient Egyptian times. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't know if that's a space that I would feel like I have wisdom on. I think the piece for me is that even like the simple word desire comes from ancient Greek meaning from the stars. So people believed during that time that we felt a connection to a star that was literally whispering to us what we wanted. And that for me is like, how do we find the enchantment in our world through the words that we use? And that to me was like this magical meeting point of where kind of astrology, cosmos, and language could all come together.
And, when it comes to being in this very esoteric world and translating it into the business world, right? Because, it can be thought of as a dichotomy where there's this very like rich, beautiful, deep, less tangible way of focusing your attention and energy in the world, but then also making that into a business, being self-employed in the holistic arts. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's true. I think that's what's tricky about working in the healing arts and holistic arts is that you're really having to be with these two sides of the brain. One side where I have to have a business hat so that I can pay rent and like make enough money to survive in the Bay Area, which is no small feat. And then also be able to stay enough in my intuition and in these other spaces so that my client work is meaningful and is connected. So yeah, it's definitely a balancing act I've found between those two parts of myself.
And, I'm curious when it comes to, I know that we did a session with an emphasis on astrocartography at a time when I was moving around a lot. I think it was actually right before a digital nomad chapter. So I'm curious about, let's say for someone who hasn't, maybe they've dabbled in astrology, but they haven't gotten a personalized reading. What are some examples of different people in different scenarios that have come to you and what they've learned in that process?
Yeah, I think the great thing about astrology is that it's just so versatile. It's been so kind of oversimplified with the popularity of it that working with an astrologer one-on-one for me is really where you get that juice of seeing the complexity in yourself getting mirrored back with someone. And so for me, astrology is kind of ideal for like any sort of transition, any sort of decision. You can figure out best places to live and work based on your chart. You can figure out the timing of maybe when it makes sense to move, when it makes sense to travel, when to really be able to commit more to a partnership versus going through a phase where you're not feeling it. Times when you might need more alone time and more reflective time versus phases where you need to kind of be more in the momentum. So for me, it's like working with the cosmic energies is what can be easier to understand when you're working with, I think, an astrologer one-on-one.
And let's say that someone is looking to discern what is credible astrological information online. How can they go about making sure that they're getting information that is accurate, but also maybe it's in layman's terms enough for them to be able to understand?
Yeah, that's so helpful, Stephanie, because sometimes I'm shocked at the things that people read online and like believe are true about astrology. And I do think this is the shadow side of when something becomes really popular. It's like you want to make it understandable, obviously, but even apps like CoStar and the Pattern, they may be fun entertainment wise, but they're really not helping you understand astrology. And so I like to use the discernment in terms of like, how general is it? Is it staying with just dichotomy thinking? So is it saying this is going to happen on this day, this is good or this is bad? That's a red flag for me around that isn't holding the complexity, it's holding polarity. And for me, astrology really comes alive when we get out of the split thinking and more into like every planet and every sign is good and bad. And so that is a big thing I look for when I'm looking at online astrology, is looking at that.
Yeah, so actually, let's take a moment to dive into CoStar and Earn, because I know lots of people refer to that app. I personally have referred to those apps at certain points in time. And even taking a look at CoStar in particular, it'll say today is a great day for your social life, or it's not a great day for your love life, or there's pressure. I don't think they say it's a bad day, but it's like there's pressure in that area, and it'll give you a list of words, like go for long walks, don't go for rereading pages, or kind of like abstract. So I'm curious, some people may actually become dependent on reading these daily sort of, guidance things, and maybe they won't have a date on a day where there's pressure in love, or maybe, they'll decide to not go to a party. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think CoStar the Pattern can be really fun for entertainment purposes, but to take it further than that, to me feels a little like, let's be suspicious of an app that tells us that like a day is good for this and not good for that. Because really being human, our days, there's space for all of it all the time. And I think the big discerning factor is knowing your own chart helps you understand what to pay attention to and what not to. So those apps just use an algorithm that are really generalized, not personalized to your chart in a way that can really show you what's meaningful in a moment. And so I always feel like the best medicine is knowing your chart, working with an astrologer ideally, but also just knowing your chart and getting a basic sense of how transits work and how time works in astrology, so that you don't have to get attached to those kind of abstract or more simplified ways of thinking about time.
And that's a great point, that it's really not one size fits all. Certainly I know, let's say people that graduate to the Pattern or CoStar, maybe they were previously just looking at their sun sign, and so that it can feel like it's more in depth. So, let's say someone is listening to this right now and they're like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take Rebecca's advice to go deeper than that and not oversimplify it. What are some aspects of their chart that you believe they should begin to dive into that won't necessarily cause overwhelm? What are maybe the top 3 aspects that are the most in a general sense?
Yeah. So I know that depending on the type of astrology someone's studying, this is also different. So a lot of the really popular astrologers are actually super traditional lineages, where there is this sense of like one planet is good, one planet is bad. So for me, the way to kind of get out of the super oversimplification in looking at your chart is I don't start with houses. Signs are a great place to start, but really for me, where the juice is knowing the relationships between the planets and your sun and your moon. So an example is like, oh, I know that my Mercury is in Gemini. Well, but do you know if that planet is in a relationship to your sun and your moon or other really personal parts of your chart? Because that's the way to understand what is unique to you and how your personality expresses itself more versus just kind of knowing bits and pieces without how they come together.
Well, and how important is it that someone actually understand the nuances versus go to an astrologer that has expertise and can kind of let them know the information without having an understanding of, let's say, the transits or their chart on its own?
Yeah, I think it just really depends on the person, and like what you want from astrology, right? If you want to deepen your relationship to this ancient practice, then I think it's better to do with people. If self-study is your way of kind of just like orienting to the basics, but that you're not taking it too seriously and thinking, because it's really hard to read your own chart. I had a rule where I would study my own chart for 5 years, no one else's chart, not even look at other people's charts. And then I would feel comfortable looking at other charts and kind of examining it, because it's hard to understand your own chart and all those nuances, and it takes time. And so I'm not a fan of self-study. I'm more of I learned astrology in a group of women over the course of 8 years. And that, to me, the community aspect, hearing the experiences of, okay, for you, that sign shows up like this and that planet shows up like this, but for me, it looks more like this. That sort of nuance for me is also something that can be beneficial with other people rather than just trying to do it by yourself.
And what's kind of coming up right now is this, this theme of nuances where, it's not one size fits all for that, but that not even looking at houses and saying, okay, like, let's say this house is in, this sign or whatever. So I can just like make sense of myself in this generalized way. So I'm curious, I'd like to kind of take a moment to go through, 3 very relevant areas in most people's lives. So love, career, and home. What are some atypical aspects? If you were to give someone one aspect, let's say we'll start with love, to look at in their holistic chart that maybe not every, more broad app would have you look at, what would you recommend?
Yeah. So love specifically, I would say looking at the moon and the asteroid Juno. So the moon is how we form attachments and bonds. And so you can have a relationship that looks great on paper. That's maybe more like the sun, like it looks good out in the world, but the emotional realm is missing. And so looking at the moon and looking at your moon, specifically what planets are in relationship to your moon, what make it maybe sometimes more anxious versus a little bit more avoidant and distancing, knowing those patterns of your own chart are helpful. And then also Juno, the asteroid of partnership. So there's a difference between Venus and Juno. Venus wants to flirt and have fun and date. Juno wants to commit and be partnered. And so I find it really important when I'm looking at people's charts to understand what Juno wants, because that's how you kind of keep your eye on partnership and qualities you want in a partner.
That's so interesting. And especially, I'm thinking about there are so many different dating climates that are available, both traditional and non-traditional. So how does that factor in with more like traditional nuclear family, like sorts of love paths versus, I can't even begin to say how many different types are available in the San Francisco Bay Area in particular, but you know what I mean? Is there any relationship there?
The relationship between, I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, yeah. So the relationship between being more, let's say, traditional, but the thing is, astrology probably transcends the man-made construct of the nuclear family. But I am curious if you have noticed a relationship with Juno and Venus as it relates to going down that path versus maybe, choosing a more, just like a different life path than that.
Yeah, specifically to relationships. So I tend to look at the 7th house as giving us a sense of the type of relationships we're looking for. Mm-hmm. Venus is like the people we're magnetized to, but the 7th house is the type of relationship. So I certainly see in some people's charts, If there's an Aquarius in the seventh house, or there's Uranus, the planet of kind of non-traditional, they're more likely that I've noticed to be, not wanting to just settle down and get married. Maybe they're more polyamorous. Maybe their relationships, they live separately. The chart gives lots of clues around what kind of keeps the soul happy, but it certainly is like a combination of factors rather than just like one discerning feature.
Yeah, and I can see that being so valuable for, let's say if someone's in a period of time where they're, contemplating, wait, the way that everything's always been done, is that for me? So yeah, some food for thought. And when it comes to the realm of career and maybe finances, making money, what are some aspects that people don't always look at that they should look at?
Yeah, so when I think about career, and I think this is something I've mentioned to you before, but I really appreciate separating out career from life purpose. And so for me, career specifically involves looking at the 10th house, which is like, what do you have going on at the top of your chart? It's like a compass of your direction. But also for me, picking a career path has to do with the sun. What lights you up? What makes you feel good? If you have strengths and skills that are going to keep your sun shiny, obviously it makes more sense to kind of move towards those things rather than places where your sun doesn't get as enlivened. So those are two really specific things when people are talking about their career path that I like to explore together.
Yeah. And okay, so when it comes to home, so that's something where, let's say, love and a sense of, career, community, everything kind of intersects. That's where a feeling of safety can happen or not. So yeah, I'm curious when it comes to, I have on a higher level, I've heard a lot about your sun line and astrocartography being very important for a place where you could feel really comfortable and at home, planting yourself. But is there anything else that people should look for?
Yeah. So for me, home is such a big question because the moon in your chart gives you the sense of what you need to feel safe in a space. And I truly believe we can be happy anywhere. Like our life will unfold anywhere. But in the chart, specifically looking at the moon and looking at the fourth house area of the chart can be really helpful for understanding what specifically you need. But astrocartography is a great tool and I love it, but there's so many layers. So the location itself has its own birth chart. And sometimes the birth chart even if you've got great lines there, that city may not work well for you because the relationship between your chart and that city's chart aren't a match. Or the culture of a place or the landscape of the place actually doesn't meet what your moon needs. And so I actually think for home lines, moons can actually be a really great place to settle in. Saturn lines can be great to settle in. The lines about where it's easier or not, to me, aren't so important as like, does your natal chart feel good? Does your moon feel good?
Yeah. So actually, for anyone who's not familiar, if we could break down, it seems like the next step after knowing and identifying with your sun sign is then getting into the rising and the moon. So for those who don't know, how would you break those definitions down?
Yeah. So I actually tend to think of the chart as the layers beginning with the rising. So I tend to think of layers as we go, the rising, the sun, and the moon. And in that order tends to be how we kind of reveal ourselves to people. So the rising is new situations. It's like the lens through which the chart sees the world and ourselves. So the rising also shows up often in new situations. So a first date, a job interview, meeting someone for the first time at a party where you don't know anyone. That's where the rising tends to kind of take over because it's the sense of self hasn't expressed itself yet, which is the sun. And so then as you're feeling more comfortable or safe in a space or with people, then the sun is what lights us up. It's what we shine into the world. It's our personality. It's what we show others. And then you get my cat's tail is
saying hello
right here. And then after that process becomes the moon, which is, okay, what's happening internally? How are the emotions expressing themselves? What is the rhythm of the internal world? And so those are kind of how I break them down. But for me, there is an order of rising, sun to moon.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting about that is that it sort of focuses on the more, it's not superficial, connecting with other people, and then goes into, it kind of goes layer by layer into your internal world, into that soul purpose. And, that kind of leads us to like, how can people use astrology as a tool to align with their path and purpose?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's such a big question, but for me, astrology is like the only way that I found I'm able to align with my life path and purpose. And for that, I like to think about, the sun, and basically the whole chart is our life purpose. It's our soul's unfolding journey. It's the balancing between the conscious mind of the sun and the unconscious of the moon. That's why we're here, more self-awareness, the individuation journey, as Jung would call it. Centroversion is the way that Eric Neumann would call it. But it's this pathway to becoming more ourselves. And so for me, that's our life purpose. So the career path or a life calling or how we support that life purpose unfolding changes over time. So it may be that for a while, someone is a coach or an astrologer, and that's how the life purpose is moving through them. Other times it's when they become a parent, or when they start a job working or being a writer. So there's just so many different ways that the purpose signals a compass, but the way we get there over time may shift. And so for me, the chart allows me to see the timing, but also what is going to enlighten me and enliven me, and that balancing act between what the life purpose really wants to show me.
Well, and in that vein, I'd love to actually hear about your trajectory of when you knew that this was your life path, and maybe any resistance that came up, or, how early or how recently you really, owned your role as Wild Witch of the West.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm definitely in a phase where I think I'm actually questioning a bit of my path. Like I was someone who worked in an office and did really well in groups of people, and in communities creating something. And that stability, like, I just don't know that I recommend self-employment for everyone. So the path that I took was that I actually started out in government work. I was in public relations for about 7 years, public relations and communications. I was a film publicist. And then I moved to the Bay Area and got my master's in philosophy, and then kind of just dabbled in a few different things, ended up going back into marketing briefly. And then about 7 years ago, I started my business doing that full time. And so, yeah, I would say that it's been my career calling to be a holistic healer and to work with clients, but that it's definitely not my life purpose. And so I imagine that there is going to be a moment where maybe it isn't as much of my path anymore, and kind of staying open to it as that shifts and changes.
I really love to explore what you mentioned about separating our life purpose from our life calling through the lens of how you define ambition.
Yeah. So for me, ambition has a lot to do with like using my strengths in the world, and doing things that support my life purpose. And so activities or kind of things where I get to use what my soul has to offer, but that also that the identity doesn't become wrapped up in what I'm doing. And so that's why I like to separate out purpose from path, is I really don't want the identity to become what you do versus who you're becoming.
Yeah. So it's kind of like safeguard for not being caught in this projection of who you once were that was comfortable, when you can't really hold on to that. And sometimes if people try to hold on to that, then you're not fully stepping into your purpose because you're no longer present or even really that open to the future.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really great point. That's some food for thought. And, kind of even in a word or in a phrase, what does holistic ambition mean to you?
Yeah. So holistic ambition to me does mean finding different pathways to express ourselves in the world, separate from life purpose and our path, but also taking care of ourselves in the process. I think the old model of life path is where you give everything to your career path and what you're doing for the world, and then there's really nothing left for you. And so when I separate out with life purpose, I'm able to realize like, okay, my business is not me. It's not why I'm here. And so that gives me the permission to make sure that I am taking care of myself emotionally, physically, intellectually, and all those other places.
Yes. So I love that you're bringing up this concept of, certainly having these gifts, honing them, sharing them, but having it maybe not even be the central focus of how you're leading your life. It's something that gets to embellish your life without being all of it in its entirety, which is certainly what I view holistic ambition to be about. There's room for that. And, so say that there are people watching, listening that are curious about perhaps getting a reading with you, staying connected, learning more. How can they do that?
Yeah. So thanks for giving this space for a little self-promotion. Appreciate it. So my business name is Wild Witch of the West, and my website is just wildwitchwest.com. And I'm on Instagram, the handle at Wild Witch of the West. And so I have one-on-one sessions with clients. I also have like a larger package that's just about purpose, where it's kind of going through some of the topics that Stephanie and I talked about, where it's life purpose versus life calling, love, home, and kind of how that unfolds together through the chart.
Thank you so much for your time today, Rebecca Farrar. And thank you everyone at home or wherever you are for watching and tuning in. Consider this your invitation to go ahead and subscribe to be the very first to know of our next Holistic Ambition speaker in the series. Wishing you a beautiful day. Until next time.